What's going on, everyone? The new year is approaching quickly for me. By the time this video comes out, I'm sure a lot of you have already been in the new year for maybe even a few hours at this point, depending on where you are in the world. But I figured we'd go and do a little bit of a reflecting back on the last year of Star Wars Unlimited. We're actually approaching our 1-year anniversary with the game. We are just a couple months away. And, well, the future of Star Wars Unlimited looks pretty good. But this time, I wanted to do it with a little bit of data. And I have been doing YouTube for a good amount of time now. And this is something that I just do as someone who creates content, because while I do love the games, I also love YouTube. And I also don't really want to be playing games that maybe don't have a ton of population with them. And maybe this is like, oh, maybe you don't really like the game. You just like YouTube. You just like views. And let's be honest, guys, YouTube, I like views. I like going ahead and seeing the numbers rise. YouTube is a very big passion of mine, while also Star Wars Unlimited is. And so I research oftentimes a lot about the games, kind of the direction that they're going, and more so outside of the game itself in terms of how it relates to kind of the market around it. And so I wanted to dive in and talk a little bit about just reviewing some of the popularity of the game from some of the searches that we can see, while also talking about some of the sets related to some of the dates that we'll see. And so let's pop over to Google Trends, which is a very base level, easy to digest, and easy kind of discussion starter for Star Wars Unlimited. And mind you, guys, this graph that you're seeing is honestly one of the better ones that I have seen. I have been playing, again, a ton of different games over the years, and especially if you ever get into like mobile games, or heck, even if you dive into some of the PC games, a lot of these graphs look even more drastic than the one you're seeing in terms of drop off. But as you see, starting off in March, which was the official release of Star Wars Unlimited, when we got Spark of the Rebellion, we actually did not peak in terms of, at least from Google Trends, Google searches on Star Wars Unlimited. We had a resurgence after dropping off in interest, which generally happens in any card game with new sets, when Set 2 came out, Shadows of the Galaxy, peaking the web searches that we've seen with Star Wars Unlimited. Now, what's interesting to see is Set 3 didn't actually bring back a ton of interest. Releasing back in November 8th, we only saw a small resurgence, but we did see a couple of spikes when it came to planetary qualifiers, and a couple of spikes when it came to bigger announcements. We did see a little bit of a spike, probably because of the Boba ban alongside Set 3, but we're probably entering a place where Star Wars Limited, in terms of popularity, is going to continue to gather its, well, returning players for each set, and not necessarily pull in a massive chunk of new audience, because the game has been, well, not established necessarily, because the game is not even a year old, but it's starting to become that way, where it's a little bit harder to break into. Now, Spark of Rebellion was massive in terms of popularity. Almost everyone agrees that Spark of Rebellion is the best set in terms of synergy, power level, kind of balancing between a lot of the different things in the set, in terms of aspects, cards, with the exception of Boba Fett, which is why he got banned, but also just set thematic alongside the playability. This is largely deemed as the best set for the vast majority of the player base. And you could see, especially for almost 2 months of the game, we saw basically a steady interest in it, which was absolutely crazy. Now, what's more interesting to me is that because Set 1 was so successful in terms of Star Wars Unlimited, and we had such a product shortage, people were really chomping at the bit to see a new set. And that's why we saw a massive resurgence for Set 2. But because of, I guess you could say, the lack of fulfilling the hype with Set 2, I think we saw a very large drop off, because people were expecting more of a Set 1, and we received, well, Shadows of the Galaxy, which is significantly weaker in terms of not only power level, but also just interest in terms of thematic, right? A lot of people aren't really interested in the far reaches of the galaxy and things that are not necessarily mainstream compared to the Lukes, the Skywalkers, the Clone Wars, the original trilogy, that type of stuff. But despite that, we still saw a pretty reasonable player base stick around in terms of set 2. It wasn't like, okay, the game is completely dead and we're seeing like a cliff of a drop off. We have seen that in other games. Now, TCGs are a little bit different because usually the people that are enjoying the gameplay of them, we don't see as much of a drop off. And we do see this kind of cyclical where we see a set release, it's popular, we see it drop off because the set gets stale, we see a set release, it gets popular, and people might come back for specific tournaments, etc. Now, as I said with set 3, it looks like the hype really died down in terms of, okay, this is the best TCG out there type conversation, and more of, hey, set 3 is coming out, it looks like a pretty cool set with an interesting thematic, why don't you come back? And that's where we're starting to see a more stable sort of search pattern in terms of popularity with the game with set 3. And I wouldn't be surprised if we stabilize somewhere around here going forward. Now, also, what's interesting is to go ahead and compare some of the other trading card games in terms of popularity, but also cyclical nature. What you'll notice is Star Wars Unlimited is significantly less popular than something like Lorcana, or even if you're to pop in something, another card game. I know Flesh and Blood was a pretty big one for a while, but you could see here, Lorcana, significantly more popular as just a card game. Flesh and Blood, kind of in the midst of Star Wars Unlimited in terms of how popular that game is. These are, well, you could say, very similar in terms of newer games that came out. Flesh and Blood's actually, well, a decent chunk older than Star Wars Unlimited. So is Lorcana, but reasonably in terms of stature compared to Star Wars Unlimited. And they have a very similar cyclical nature, especially Lorcana coming back for each new set. If you were to start to add things like Magic the Gathering in here, I'm sure, and I don't even know which kind of search term would be the most accurate in terms of Magic the Gathering, you'll notice that all of these are dwarfed in comparison to Magic the Gathering just because of how popular the game is. I mean, we are seeing like 100 times more searches compared to Flesh and Blood and Star Wars Unlimited. So that's not really necessarily something that I usually compare against, because Magic the Gathering is like the king of these types of card games. Just to give you an idea on where we stand in terms of a card game. But overall, the game looks pretty healthy and pretty, well, standard in terms of a game that you might expect coming out and hopefully showing its colors as a TCG. The developers, what we're seeing in terms of design decisions, seemingly incorporating a lot of interesting new design mechanics, especially with set 4. Since we're seeing these 4-month set releases, I wouldn't be surprised to see the set 4 jump to light speed or jump to hyperspace. Jump to light speed. Why did I say jump to hyperspace? Jump to light speed, right? Why am I feeling like that is not the right one? It's obviously jump to light speed, but I want to say jump to hyperspace. Releasing in February. I think one of the big things that could make the kind of interest in Star Wars Unlimited stay a little bit less of a cyclical and more stable is shorter set releases, where we see 3-month set releases instead of 4 months. I think that's a pretty standard way of going about things. Magic the Gathering has obviously gone way in the deep end, where we have set releases almost like, feels like every week. But if you don't want to really give your consumers product fatigue, then getting 3-month set releases is something a little bit more reasonable to the consumer. But all that to say, this is just talking about sort of the online popularity of a game. Of course, depending on which metric you talk about, it can completely change. In terms of YouTube popularity, well, it peaked back in the set release. And again, we're seeing a pretty stable curve for a trading card game. Similar to the web searches, set 2, big resurgence. Set 3, not nearly as much. A small resurgence, but not nearly as much. And I expect it to remain the same. So the game seems healthy in terms of metrics. And well, we also have a big old tournament coming up at the very start of 2025, not set 4, but the very start of 2025, early January, we're going to start seeing a bunch of planetary qualifiers. We're going to see the meta develop even further. What's also interesting about this is in 2025, we are going to see not only the planetary qualifiers, but also hopefully the rest of the very big tournaments, including the Galactic Championships, taking place in 2025, a bigger development of the Star Wars Unlimited competitive space, which is something that, well, hopefully will bring a lot of players. As you can see here in Las Vegas, we have the Galactic Championship for Season 0. And assuming after this, since Season 0 is kind of like a probationary period for the Star Wars Unlimited competitive space, we might see a lot more development of it, maybe changes in terms of rules, and maybe more active participation in terms of the balance of the game. But surprisingly enough, the balance of Star Wars Unlimited seems pretty good. Of course, it's really hard to say without referring to some of these big tournaments, since we don't have things like online spaces to go ahead and compare meta and data, where Magic the Gathering and other games like it have things like, well, Magic Arena, where you're able to see the actual decks take place and tournaments take place at a regular pace, so where you can actually see the meta shape up. When you're in a situation where you don't have that online space and you're purely relying on physical tournament data, it's a lot more difficult to gather the sample size needed to really see the balance of the game. And that's something that's actually, in some cases, a little bit more interesting, because you may never know what the meta truly is because of it. And heck, if you refer to set 2, when we saw the planetary qualifiers take place, Boba Green wasn't really on everyone's super high list. Like, yes, it was of the top decks, but in terms of previous tournament data, Boba Green had only just started to become a deck that really we started to see massive success with. Earlier on, Boba Green had not had the results, perhaps because of the sample size being too small, or maybe the players piloting them, not necessarily the best players in terms of that tournament. So it's really hard to tell, and that gives you a lot of hope for potentially the future of Star Wars Limited competitive space, where there's a lot more, well, interest in theory crafting and trying to figure out what deck to bring. So all of that is a lot of excitement around Star Wars Unlimited. But in terms of the future, outside of just the competitive space in 2025, as we mentioned, we have set 4 coming in February. We also have the future sets, and a big thing that they mentioned is the rotation. So for those of you that may be diving into Star Wars Unlimited as one of your first trading card games, rotation is something where you have X amount of sets in a rotation. Let's just say 6 for the sake of explanation here. After the next set releases, let's say we dive into set 7, well, set 1 would then be rotated out. And what that means is you have a format where only set 2 through 7 are legal cards. You can no longer play the set 1 cards in that format. This is something that they mentioned that they are interested in doing. And so the announcement of rotation could very well come in 2025. And that introduces a whole new format to the game, right? Because with rotation, you're going to have somewhat of a standard format, which is the most recent 6 sets. And then you have a more, well, just for the sake of, comparing it to like Magic, a more vintage format where you have all of the sets involved in one format. You have a very high power level format, most likely with older cards and more interesting combinations. And then you have a more, recent format with the last 6 sets. Again, who knows how they're going to divide it up? Who knows what they're going to do in terms of rotation and all that good stuff? But it is something that's very likely to show up in 2025 and give us, well, a whole new dynamic to Star Wars Unlimited. So between new sets, between the rotation, and between the advancement of competitive play in Star Wars Unlimited, we have a lot to look forward to. And to be honest, there's not a whole lot of negatives that I can bring up right now. Of course, you could bring up, well, maybe the overprinting of set 3. You could bring up maybe just a little bit of lack of balance in set 1 in terms of Boba Fett specifically. Outside of that, there wasn't really a whole lot of imbalance. But honestly, I mean, FFG, they've handled the Boba Fett situation, I would say, pretty nicely. They've handled the balance of the game pretty nicely. They've kept our interest, and it seems like they're listening to feedback, which is all things that I am kind of looking for as someone that not only plays the game, but is also someone covering content on the game. I look forward to future spoilers, as well as the last thing that we have to mention, Carbonite boosters, which is something that is releasing in 2025 with the invention of, set 4. So we will see how Carbonite boosters are received. Of course, there is always going to be the portion of the player base that's going to be like, okay, they're a little bit too expensive because Carbonite boosters are the premium boosters. They're going to be sold at a premium price. They're not going to be participating in that. But in terms of collectors and people that want those higher, not quality, but higher rarity / more interesting style of cards, well, that is what they're there for. And that could bring a lot of drum in the game, because one of the also big things about trading card games is not only do your gameplay have to be good, not only do you have to have a competitive scene to kind of bring in those sections of the players, but also the collectability of your card game is oftentimes what brings in a lot of casual players and a lot of longevity to your game. And while there is a small part of Star Wars Limited that you could really collect, there isn't really a good place for collectors to sink their teeth in Star Wars Unlimited. Not just because the game is small right now, but also because they haven't really pushed that side of things. And this Carbonite boosters with the new, I forgot what they call it, but the Carbonite style of card, I think it's Prestige Edition. Is that what it is? If I'm wrong in the comments, someone will let me know. But I believe it's called the Prestige Edition of cards. Those types of unique art styles, unique formatting of whatever the card will look like, those are the types of things that oftentimes collectors are looking for. And we'll see if that drums up a lot more hype about the game. That said, I am very hopeful at Star Wars Unlimited. The trends look pretty solid. The overall experience of the community has been pretty solid. The overall experience from FFG has been pretty good in terms of responses and decision making. And overall, I don't really have anything bad to say. So I am looking forward to 2025, and I am looking forward for the official 1 year mark of the game. And with set for releasing, we are going to be pretty close to the 1 year mark, most likely. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. If you have anything to add, or maybe just wishing a happy new year. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all for a video tomorrow in 2025.